Huples cat. I was asked to give a brief overview of virus mutation, specifically SARS-CoV-2 virus, because it's all over the news and there's a lot of misinformation, and there's also quite a bit of biological and scientific data behind it that you kind of need to know what you're looking at. But first off, what actually is a mutation? So it's from Latin mutation m, which means I change. So basically the cell, the virus, the bacteria, or the human can be a species mutation. So in biology, it's any change in a nucleotide sequence as a result of failure of the system to revert the change. So what this actually means, if you think of cancer, the cell actually changes its properties because it's RNA inside the cell, or DNA, but in the case of viruses it's RNA, actually changes the actual properties of the cell. Most of these mutations are non-viable. The cell just dies. Sometimes they become viable. In terms of infectious diseases, it means that the disease can actually become easier to invade the host cell, hosts being humans with SARS-CoV-2, or harder to invade the host cell. So that's why there's a lot of interest in it. And there's been a lot of stuff online. You know, is there 6, 8, 30, 100,000 strains of it? We're unclear. What is clear is that there's definitive strains that infect geographical regions and then can spread outside of that region. But first off, what actually is going on to cause mutations? In biological terms, a virus is a very simple organism. Is it alive? Nobody really knows. People say yes, people say no. It's kind of irrelevant.
It's life, Jim, but not as we know it, not as we know it, not as we know it. It's life, Jim, but not as we know it, not as we know it.
It probably isn't maliciously seeking to kill us. What viruses do is they seek to replicate themselves. All life, in my opinion, I see as a life form, seeks only to replicate itself and to avoid death. And SARS-CoV-2 is definitively, in my view, doing that. So it seeks to replicate itself using accessible cells in other life forms. It doesn't breed itself, it has to have another host, another species to actually breed in. SARS-CoV-2 definitely uses human beings, and it uses cats and probably dogs and maybe something else, we're not quite sure, but it will seek to replicate itself, and it seems to be focusing on mammals. Viruses can replicate in snakes and they can replicate in fish. All life forms are susceptible to viruses. There's a lot of viruses. So the viruses have literal physical spikes on them that lock with receptors on the outside of the host cell and allow the membrane of both cells to become oily, so the cell membrane becomes permeable, allows in the virus material that's inside the virus, so it can then take over the inside of the cell and actually replicate itself, which is really cool if you think about it. On this picture, what you're looking at is the grey squiggle in the middle is actually RNA. RNA in the SARS-CoV-2 virus actually has about 30,000 possible permutations. So how many strains could there be? Around 30,000. There isn't 30,000 right now, but that's how many there could be. So either my head's got bigger or my hair shrunk. Kitty did my hair. Anyhow, I'm still having haircuts at home because I'm taking this stuff pretty seriously. So some vaccines block the cells in the human body from being sensitive to the virus. Some block the keys on the virus, the spikes on the virus, from being functional. And some viruses work entirely differently. Viruses is kind of an interesting topic, but I'm not sure if I'm ever going to get into that. Suffice to say that the virus problem they're having with the Oxford virus, if it is as reported, is extremely serious. And that is one of the reasons I am not keen, nor is Kitty, to take a vaccine early on when it hasn't had sufficient human testing. There can be really serious side effects from vaccines. Now obviously if the death rate's 10 to 20% from the disease, I'll take it. So having got inside the host cell, it replicates itself, and it can do this in quite a few different ways, so you can get different strains emerging. And what also complicates this and makes it very serious is that if inside the cell is other viral material from other viruses, the effect could be, and it hasn't happened yet, could be to get a different type of virus actually emerging from the host cell. This is how we believe viruses evolve in the wild. So it's kind of a different issue. So once they've actually converted the human cell into usually lung tissue, but it can be most cells as far as we know, once it's converted it, it then fires off lots of copies of itself or variants, different strain of itself, And if these are successful in then finding other human host cells, so on and so forth. And this process keeps up until a normal human antibody reaction kicks in, the immune system kicks in to kill off all the viral material. You have to kill all of the virus. And it's kind of fascinating we're able to do this, and we're doing it all the time. You're doing it right now. Right now you're infected with something and you are killing it off. And what happens in end stage COVID is that the immune system doesn't go into hyper overdrive, but it isn't working well enough and people's organs die. That's why you get acute respiratory distress syndrome, that's why you get multi-system organ failure, that's why you get sepsis. It's not necessarily that the virus itself is doing that, but the body's response to the virus is doing that. So there's lots of ways we can fix this. This is why solumedrol and prednisone are being used for very sick patients, because they have a lot of side effects that aren't good, for very sick patients, to try and dampen down the human body's immune system to try and prevent ARDS and sepsis and organ failure. Usually, when you have a virus that can infect a species, whatever the species is, some members of the species are immune, and that's great. So even if massive numbers of the species die, over time the ones who are normally immune are going to recover. Now, one of the problems with SARS-CoV-2 that nobody's mentioning is that a large number of people in the early 20s and early teens and 30s died during the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919. And although we don't quite know, we do think that an earlier flu pandemic that travelled around the globe a few years earlier actually primed the younger people who've been exposed to it to actually be more reactive to H1N1, Spanish flu, when it hit them, which caused the over response, which caused the death rate. So how do the viruses spread? It's all throughout the body, it's generated a lot of it. So mostly SARS-CoV-2 spreads by droplet. It's in the lung tissue, it goes into the airway, and you cough it out. Talk it out loudly, or sing, or you intubate somebody or whatever, or put pressure in the airway to try and help them. So the main principle of infection spread is droplet. Now these droplets drop and go on surfaces. So the secondary method would be touching handles, touching desks, sitting on seats and all the rest of it. I'll probably do a video where I show what I do at work, because I'm the only one that's doing it, but I'm very conscious of where the droplets might be, and I like to try and eradicate them. And now after half an hour to 4 hours I'm probably safe, but I don't like probably. That's why I'm a prepper. I like to be, I'm safe. I'm not really keen on probably. It can probably also spread from body fluids, but this is not a great route. Ebola is one of those viruses that does that, and obviously if somebody is bleeding from their eyeballs and looking very sick, you don't want to touch them, right? So one of the things is with Ebola, if you actually quarantine the area and stop people moving out of the area and make them stay in place, everybody infected gets it, most of them die, and then everybody outside that area hasn't been exposed to it. They're not immune to Ebola, but the infection's been contained. So one of the problems with a non-symptomatic transmission, which SARS-CoV-2 definitively has had since early January when China warned us, is that people can have no symptoms at all. No temperature, no sweating, nothing, no cough, no voice issues, and it can spread anyway. So that's why everybody's been told to socially distance, that's why a lot of businesses shut down, that's why people are being encouraged to wear masks, and that's why people are encouraged to wash their hands. All sane and sensible things to do in an airborne pandemic, not an attempt to control your lives, not an attempt to take your guns off you, not an infringement of your liberties, it's just smart. You don't want to catch something. If the death rate is 1 in 1,000, the chance of dying from it is really small. If the death rate's 1 in 100, that's bad. The current world death rate is about 6.8% for everybody admitted to hospitals with COVID-19. And that's not because the hospitals around the world are killing people to make money and all of those things you may have heard. It's because that's the actual death rate. The other problem with it is if you catch it and you're probably not going to die from it, you're probably not going to go to hospital with it, but you may have about a 1 in 5 chance of having months to, we don't know, but definitely months, maybe years, of very impaired life quality, breathing issues. So all of that stuff is good reasons to do safe and sensible things. Don't share coffee mugs. Wash your hands, don't touch your face, don't touch the face mask except to take it off, and wear one. And if you don't want to do that, then just stay away from people, because people are the vector. It's not my cats, it's not my dogs, it's Kitty. Kitty's the one likely to catch it and give it to me, I might catch it and give it to Kitty, but because of the nature of her ICU and rapid response job, she's more likely to give it to me. But that's all for me. I hope this bit of a biology primer is actually helpful to people. What I'm going to put up after this one is actually the different strains that we face with and what's going on, and talk about the potential or the lack of potential for SARS-CoV-2 to evolve into a strain that would have a much higher infectivity and a much higher death rate, and what that would mean. It actually might mean that this whole thing could be over a lot quicker, but it also would mean a lot more people would suffer and die. So be careful what you wish for. Anyway, remember in SHTF, tomorrow will always be worse than today, unless you prep. And part of prepping is to make sure that you take all possible precautions that are rational and sane to avoid being badly damaged or badly impacted by a current SHTF. Denial is a river in Egypt. This was a Cat in a Box production, 2020. Doodles. And some work in entirely different... Fuck, I've got...